My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the executive director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings. We have 3,000 members worldwide. Many scientists, physicists, PhDs, metallurgists, biologists, all the way down to just the average citizen who really wants to get involved. Some of those have chosen to become field investigators, and they go through our field investigative training courses. They become part of the team in their state or country where they reside, and they actually get engaged in going out and meeting this phenomena head on. We've recently formed a science review board, and that board is made up of scientists from around the United States and around the world to review some of our more significant cases and try to render an opinion on them. What we'd like to do is be more outbound, more outspoken in terms of the really true UFO cases. So MUFON is moving forward with this approach, and we'll be publishing papers in these different areas to allow the general public and even the scientific community to be able to be challenged by what we're finding. That's the strength of MUFON as an organization, is being really the truth seekers of the UFO field.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. One of the enduring myths about the UFO subject is that it all started in the United States on the 24th of June with Kenneth Arnold, who saw flying saucers in Washington State. It didn't start with Kenneth Arnold. He didn't see flying saucers. He saw crescent-shaped objects, which later became known as flying saucers or flying discs. It's also generally accepted that Roswell was the first retrieval of an alleged alien vehicle. It wasn't. There were several in World War II, several in various parts of the world, including New Mexico in 1945, Missouri in 1940, apparently. It's also a myth that governments began official investigations in 1947. They didn't. They started in 1933, in Italy and Sweden, as a matter of fact. If we can have the next slide. Okay, they'll try and sharpen these things up. This is an interesting report. That's better. Dating back to June 1933. It's been authenticated. It's a highly confidential telegram from the Director of Special Affairs, and it states, on the personal order of Il Duce, that's Mussolini, absolutely no mention is to be made of the alleged landing of an unknown craft on national soil. Maximum penalty for non-compliance will be enforced by the Tribunal for State Security. And the Italians, in fact, under Mussolini, set up a top-secret special research group, number 33. And Mussolini presided. He was very interested in the subject, himself being a pilot. And it was also directed by Marconi, the famous engineer. And there were a number of astronomers and various dignitaries who headed this top-secret group. Next, please. That's just a Japanese Navy photograph of UFOs taken in the Pacific during World War II. The so-called Foo Fighters are often referred to as amorphous blobs, if controlled or semi-controlled. But really, there were many other reports of other kinds of UFO reported by pilots and others during the Second World War. Let's go to the next slide. You won't be able to read any of that for the time being, sharpen up some of it. It relates to, it's a Ministry of Defense report, classified secret at the time and declassified a few years ago. It relates to the sighting by the crew of a Lancaster bomber who claimed to have seen a large object traveling at about 500 miles an hour on one occasion. And there was another sighting by the same crew of this Lancaster bomber over Amsterdam of a craft which was seen on the ground at first and later maneuvering at high speed. Again, these weren't amorphous blobs. They were apparently solidly controlled machines. Next slide, please. The Lancaster bomber was the most used of the heavy bombers by the Royal Air Force in the Second World War, and I suppose the American equivalent for the US Army Air Forces would be the B-17 Flying Fortress. For the first time, I've published in my new book an extraordinary report by a radio radar operator on board a Lancaster in 1944. Now, they were coming back. If we can have the next slide, please. The crew was returning from a bombing trip over France, and they had been the lead bomber. Suddenly, the radio navigator noticed that the screen went blank, and the captain suddenly shouted, "What the hell is that?" So the navigator, radar operator, went up into the Astrodome, which had a 360-degree view. And he saw an enormous string of lights that it seemed like miles in length. And then he said a gray saucer-like object emerged as part of the lights. Can we have the next slide, please? This is not a photograph, unfortunately. It's a sketch by this radio radar observer of this enormous object, and this is how he described it. Our Lancaster was a large aeroplane, but the only comparison I can make is that we were but a dot on a sheet of foolscap paper. After 3 minutes, it shot away at phenomenal speed, and the crew was left with an extraordinary feeling of calmness, which they were completely at a loss to explain. When they landed at their base at RAF Oakington in Cambridgeshire, they were astonished that there was a great deal more of the normal intelligence officers for the debriefing, and they weren't remotely interested in the bombing raid. They wanted to know about the flying saucer. That was 1944, so they weren't just foo fighters in the 1940s during World War II. There were many large objects seen. Next slide, please. This is Commander Jean Kisling of the Free French Air Force on a detachment at Selfridge Field, Michigan. He was an instructor on P-47D and P-47N Thunderbolt fighters, and he's shown here at Oscoda in Michigan in 1944. He tells me that in July of 1945, there were sightings of what the military thought were the Japanese Fugo balloons, many of which were coming over at that time, mostly on the West Coast, but some made it as far as Michigan. And they were seen over the Selfridge Field base, Army Air Forces base. So the commander of the base asked for a volunteer to go and shoot down the Japanese balloons. Now, I know the American government's none too happy with the French for their failure to participate in the Iraqi war, but be it known that a Frenchman was the first to volunteer for the mission to protect America from what they thought were Japanese invaders. Anyway, Kisling took off. He went to the maximum height, the maximum service ceiling that his plane could reach. He managed to get one of these balloons in sight, and it looked spherical at first. And then he managed to get it in his gun sights, and 8, I think, 50 caliber machine guns converged on it as far as he knew. He started firing, and suddenly this thing flipped on edge to a disc and shot off at a phenomenal speed. And at that point, as he was telling me this, he said, I realized it was no balloon. Kisling told me that he learnt that a jet plane sent to chase another flying disc later on that summer was knocked out of the sky, apparently by the disc, in the vicinity of this very, very city we're in right now. Next, please. The ghost rockets, I've reproduced a few new, or relatively new documents from the National Archives. It's very interesting regarding the so-called ghost rockets, which were never satisfactorily explained. My book has a foreword by one of the world's leading aviation historians, Bill Gunston. And as you'll read in the book, he's absolutely convinced that these ghost rockets were not Russian in origin. And often, you know, they were seen flying, they were diving, they were crashing into lakes, they were taking off from lakes. They were all over the place, particularly in Scandinavia, but many other parts of the world. There was an invasion of these things. And on one occasion at least, if we can have the next slide, there were encounters with the Saab B-18 bomber. And these photographs show that particular bomber, and in the next slide you can see a report from the Washington Post of a crash with one of these bombers involving one of the so-called ghost rockets, and 3 crew members were killed in collision. Of the other pilots who saw these things, none reported fins or any control surfaces of any kind on these so-called ghost rockets, which of course you need on conventional rockets. Next, please. Now, in April-May 1947, they began launching captured V-2 rockets, captured from the Germans by the Americans. Some went to Russia, were captured by the Russian army, and so forth, but the best of the team, headed by von Braun, Werner von Braun, was taken to White Sands, New Mexico, and by 1947 they started firing these things, and this is the launch of one of the first ones at White Sands. Interestingly, during several launches, unknown objects, often described as discs, were seen in the vicinity, and on one occasion, one was seen to fly around a V-2 rocket and to send it off course so that it crashed prematurely. Rockets don't land normally, certainly at that time, and it crashed prematurely. And if we can possibly get some idea from the next slide, it was officially confirmed. I'm sorry you can't read this very clearly, but it was officially confirmed by the director, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Turner, commanding officer of White Sands, that peculiar phenomena were responsible for the V-2 going astray. Official. Next. Well, what happened next was that the US Army in particular, and to a lesser extent Army Air Forces, started firing at these things at every available opportunity. They'd fired at them, as you all know, in 1942. 1,430 rounds of anti-aircraft shells were fired at these things in Los Angeles during a 5-hour alarm witnessed by over 1 million people, confirmed officially by the American government, a letter signed, a memorandum, secret memorandum from George C. Marshall, 5-star general. But they started firing at these things, and according to information supplied for me, a lot of research material for this book, provided for me by John Andy Kistner, a former Las Cruces representative for New Mexico, and also an aerospace engineer with a good background in aerospace business, did a lot of research into this period, and it's quite obvious that there was a conflict situation. Once we began firing at these things, there was phenomenal retaliation. And in New Mexico, a number of objects were seen wobbling around the skies, and it's my information that 2 of these craft, at least, came down and became known collectively as the Roswell incident. It took them several days to come down after being shot. The Army was firing at them not only with anti-aircraft shells, but with missiles using proximity fuses for maximum effect. And there were lots of witnesses to these things. Next, please. And then, if we can just have that made a bit smaller. Can you reduce the size? Thank you. That sounds bad news. No? The next one, please, and a bit smaller. Thank you very much. Just a little bit smaller. Is it possible? Other way around. Thank you very much. Anyway, what ensued in May, June, July, and continuing in 1947 was a worldwide series of extraordinary and mostly unexplained air disasters. We're not just talking about the United States, ladies and gentlemen. It was worldwide. Airliners were unable to take off. They could not unstick. They crashed at the end of the runway, killing passengers. They dropped out of the sky, often not long after takeoff. Military planes sent to intercept the UFOs were knocked out of the sky by some mysterious force. The official explanation was that the planes ran out of fuel, like 5 minutes, airliners ran out of fuel like 5 minutes after takeoff. And President Truman, there was an emergency situation, was declared. President Truman declared an emergency. Next slide, please. And there were continuing efforts to try and shoot these things down. And it talks about, that's all right, that doesn't matter, I was going to mention a bit more, but anyway, it talks here about a P-80, that's a shooting star jet fighter, was sent up. Where's the button on this? Here we go. No. Wrong way around. That's better. P-80 jet fighter was based in California, sent up. But in fact, what I have learnt is that following the recovery, or following the Roswell incident, according to my information provided by Andy Kistner, a shooting star landed on 15th of July in New Mexico on a remote stretch of Highway 380, 25 miles southwest of the Corona crash site at Carrizozo. I'd never heard of Carrizozo before. Anyone here heard of Carrizozo? Bravo. Close to the northeast corner of the White Sands missile range. Its mission, to provide air cover for the recovery operation in case another disk attempted to impede elements of the T-Force. I'm told by Kistner that a technical intelligence team known as a T-Force was dispatched to recover the disks in the New Mexico desert, and this plane was to provide air cover. On the 18th of July, the plane took off from this remote strip on the road near a garage and immediately crashed into the garage, killing at least one other person and, of course, the pilot. This event was only mentioned in a few local newspapers. Next, please. Next, thank you. That was the P-80 shooting star. It might just as well have been a pea shooter. This is a lady, Rosine Cords, who was at Roswell at the time of the Roswell incident. Her father owned the Hub Corn Ranch at the time. Her name now is Regine Cords. She was married to an Air Force guy who became Deputy Chief of Staff of Intelligence later on at Strategic Air Command. And she told me that on the 4th or 5th of July, or thereabouts, she went to collect some ice in Roswell for a picnic. But she found out, first of all, she couldn't get any from one of the dairies was closed. She went to the train station for this picnic, and she said, I went all over town looking for ice for the beer. There was none because Glenn, that is, as you know, the gentleman who came out with a great deal of testimony about the nurse and Glenn Dennis, his own participation as mortician contracted to the Roswell Army Airfield at the time. So this confirms his statement that the Army Air Forces were keen on getting ice. And actually they told her that specifically, he and the Air Force had been in to get all this material. Next, please. Werner von Braun is said to have been one of those taken to one of the crash sites. I don't know which one in particular. This is information that's been made available to me by Clark McClellan, a former NASA worker. It's interesting, there is some confirmation from Dr. Robert Sarbacker, who Mr. Dolan was talking about earlier on, that Werner von Braun would indeed have been asked to be involved in the study of the materials. Next, please. Now, I don't think many of you are familiar with the evidence supplied by a Polish biophysicist. This is a guy given the name Dr. Chris. In 1974, together with a small team of European scientists from Britain, Poland, obviously, France, and Italy, were given by NASA, they were on contract to NASA, to examine some strange materials that had been recovered allegedly from an Iron Curtain country. They were the biophysicists were completely baffled by these samples. The metal, for example, had a melting point of above 2,000 degrees Celsius. There were odd materials. But that wasn't the end of it. A few years later, in 1977, in April 1977, the same team was invited to NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Pasadena, California, where the director of this team, the same team that had been given these materials, was retiring. And during the evening's celebrations, the director offered to show them something interesting, the team. So he took them down 3 levels below at the JPL in Pasadena, April 1977, took them into a vault, a sealed vault, and showed them not only the remains of the materials that they had studied 3 years previously, but the skeletal remains of an alien. Here, you can see a skull here, and a hip bone. Now, this guy, Dr. Chris, said that there was no question, this wasn't the skeletal structure of a chimpanzee or a baby. It was genuinely inexplicable in terms of his expertise. And the exhibits, they were in sort of plexiglass material, there was a label that said, from the first and second incidents in New Mexico. And so they said, well, whereabouts in New Mexico? Sorry, we don't do specifics. That's the only information you're going to get. That's top secret. But at least they were shown these materials. And Dr. Chris learned some very, very interesting things. He said there had been at least 2 incidents, and there had been 1 survivor. We've heard that before. Their blood was similar but not identical to ours in that it showed a totally different reaction toward oxygen. Nitrogen was no good for them, apparently, so they assumed that inside their ship they must breathe a mixture of helium and oxygen. Next, please. Now, I had a friendly argument with Bud Hopkins earlier this year when I saw him in April about Colonel Philip J. Corso. He said, Tim, this guy says he was in the National Security Council. He was not. It's been proven. Well, unfortunately, Corso didn't have much of a hand in writing the day after Roswell, so there are lots of mistakes in the book. Sure, he was not on the National Security Council per se. He was on the National Security Council staff. But his military records, and they are here, prove that he was actually serving on the National Security Council's Operations Coordination Board, often known later as the Special Group or the 5412 Group. Now, this was the unit that approved and evaluated the most sensitive covert operations mounted by the United States government. So Corso was very definitely involved in a sensitive position in the National Security Council staff, and there are the records to prove it. I beg your?
Where is his name?
I'm sorry, I don't have his name there. Take it from me. These are Corso's. They are Corso's. I can't read it from here, but it's round here, round all this period. Okay, you've got it there. Intelligence staff. I think I can read. It's all that period there. Next, please. This is just part of a top secret United States Air Force Europe report, which relates to a conversation by the American US Air Force's Europe intelligence specialists with their Swedish counterparts. And it makes for some interesting reading. It talks about, I wish I could read it from here, but I hope you can. The second paragraph in particular, I think, is quite interesting. That these phenomena are obviously the result of a high technical skill which cannot be credited to any presently known culture on Earth. Next, please. This is General Vandenberg. Now, many of you may be aware of the top secret estimate of the situation provided by, or mentioned, alluded to by Captain Ed Ruppelt, who headed Project Blue Book in the 1950s. So the first head of Project Blue Book. And he said that in 1948 there was an evaluation of the situation which concluded that the unexplained UFOs were extraterrestrial in origin. And this was shown to General Vandenberg at the time, and he later on, in 1950, in fact, ordered that document and other copies to be burnt. And let's just have a look. I found the actual order to burn the document in my files in the next slide. Not very clear, but this is 1950. It is requested that action be taken to destroy all copies of the top secret air intelligence report. Because, said Vandenberg, it would cause a stampede if it was released. Next. This is just part of a secret Army document relating to the extraordinary number. There were many, many top secret and secret meetings at White Sands because of the proliferation of UFO sightings in the areas where, of course, nuclear weapons were stored and tested. And it just gives an idea of some of the, the high caliber of scientists that were involved at that time. Next. Well, what about Great Britain? Well, the British government established the top secret Flying Saucer Working Party in 1950, and it was disbanded in 1951. This is part of the disbanding note. Their remit, with the help of the Americans, was to discourage public interest and to debunk even the most, and particularly the most convincing sightings by pilots. Thus, when, the next slide please. Thus, when in September 1950, this guy, Flight Lieutenant Stan Hubbard, a test pilot at Farnborough, the experimental aircraft establishment, he and two other officers saw a 100-foot disc. And this is how he described it. He says, as it got closer, it made a heavy, dominant humming with an associated subdued crackling, hissing sound, which reminded me strongly of the ambient noise inside a large, active electrical power generating station. The periphery of the object was edged by a band of darker color which kept changing appearance, from which emanated strange, bluish, flickering points of light. Most remarkably, he continued, there was a smell of ozone that normally is associated with heavy electrical discharges. Well, their report was investigated. Remember, there was not just one pilot on the ground that saw this thing at low level, coming right over these pilots. But there were others. The Flying Saucer Working Party visited them, took their statements and everything, and concluded that they had obviously mistaken an ordinary conventional aircraft for a flying saucer. Next, please. This is an interesting letter. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's actually from the it's dated 10th of March 1950. It's sent to Dr. Robley Evans of MIT, and it's from Colonel Robert Blount, U.S. Air Force Chief Medical Research Division, Office of the Surgeon General. And the second paragraph says, I have also received information that a new report is in the process of being published and will be classified top secret. This obviously relates to the subject. It has recently been rumored that one of these so-called flying saucers crashed in Mexico. However, the details are somewhat bizarre at this moment. It's interesting to have that document officially released in the National Archives. Next, please. This is Major General Charles Cabell, who was Chief of Air Force Intelligence in 1951, later Deputy Chief of CIA. According to Captain Ed Ruppelt, there was a top-secret meeting held at the Pentagon in 1951, at which General Cabell blew his top. They had been telling him all the unexplained sightings have been sorted out, there's nothing to it, so don't worry about it. Apparently, he just glared at them all for 45 seconds and then said, I quote, I've been lied to and lied to and lied to and lied to and lied to. That's right, 5 times. I want it to stop. I want the answer to the sources, and I want a good answer. So you see, obviously, Cabell did not have need to know, not at that time, at any rate. Next, please. Okay, this is an interesting report that I've published in Need to Know. It's actually from a special Air Force unit, special group, AFOIN, special group, within Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book, a lot of the intelligence was actually compartmented, even within Blue Book, it seems. And this is a report sent to Naval Intelligence about 9 reports of submarine contacts with unknown flying or whatever, undersea. I don't know whether they were undersea or what. It's not known. I have been trying for a long time to get hold of this document. I have yet to succeed. This was 1952. Next, please. Of course, you're all familiar with the Washington merry-go-round, and on 2 occasions, at least in July of 1952, sources were all over the place. often at very low level. You read the official reports about blobs and occasional radar trackings. Nonsense. These things were seen sometimes at very low altitude, even at building level in DC by a number of witnesses. There's a lot of new information I've dug up about that. Next, please. Now, thanks to a letter which surfaced, written to NICAP's Richard Hall, a fine researcher, by the great Dr. Olavo Fontes, one of the world's greatest UFO researchers, in my opinion, a Brazilian researcher. Fontes managed to get the official United States Defense Department figures for accident statistics affecting military aircraft alone from 1952 to 1956. And here they are. There were 18,662 major accidents involving Air Force and Navy jet interceptors, mostly of the type involved in chasing UFOs. Of course, most were attributed to explainable accidents, but 9.5, that's 1,773, were due to unknown factors. Now that chimes with what Leonard Stringfield was told by several sources, that at that time the Americans were losing a plane a day to the flying saucers. Next. This is an F-9F Panther jet, and in February of 1953, First Lieutenant Ed Bolocco was sent to intercept from Edenton in North Carolina, sent to intercept a flying disc. He got to within firing distance, and he pressed the trigger on the control column. Unfortunately, the guns were empty. Then he said, with full throttle, I got to about 350 feet from the UFO when my entire cockpit was bathed in a strong blue-white light. Everything seemed to be motionless. As he glanced at his gloved hand, he was shocked to discover that he could see right through the glove and flesh to the bones. It was like an X-ray, he said. For what I think was several seconds, there was no sound, not even the sound of my engine. Suddenly there was a flash, and the UFO broke away at incredible speed as sound and motion returned. Next, please. Now, some of you may be familiar with the testimony of a chap called Fritz Werner, who claims to have seen a crashed disc with an alien occupant, at least, maybe several, in the Kingman, Arizona vicinity of May of 1953. I've now been given permission to give his real name, and it has emerged that this is thanks, I must say, to Ray Fowler, who did the original research into this case, and his second name is Stansel, and there is his affidavit. And I've also got part of his, next slide, please. There's part of his CV and just some of his publications. So, I mean, he is an established aero engineer. Next, please. I think this is one of the most phenomenal cases. It's obviously familiar to many of you, but there are newcomers here to this strange subject, and I think they'll be intrigued by this one. There were many disappearances of aircraft at this time when interceptions of UFOs were made, and this was in June of 1953 at Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts, when this F-94C Starfire was sent to intercept a disc over the Air Force Base. Well, what happens? They got to just above 1,000 feet to chase this thing when the engine conked out and all the power systems failed. So they had to think quickly. Normally, the radar operator in the back ejects first after ejecting the canopy, but he didn't do so, so the pilot decided to get out. He ejected the canopy, then he ejected, and he landed, fully expecting to see his navigator not far away. He landed in someone's garden. This was a built-up area. Not only was there no sign of the plane, there was no sign of the navigator. Neither was ever found, despite a long air-sea rescue search as well. The only thing that survived was the captain, the pilot, and the cockpit canopy. Next. I'm often asked why it is that, rather than farmers in the Brazilian outback and so forth, why is it aliens never contact our leaders, our military? Well, they have, actually. But the thing is, the higher you go, the less likely, the further you have to fall if you start talking about your contacts. I'm firmly convinced that a number of high-ranking officials have indeed had contact. It wouldn't make sense otherwise had they not had any. But this is Sir Peter Horsley, who I knew. He was Deputy Chief of Strike Command with his finger on the nuclear trigger. You've maybe read about his experiences in my book, Alien Base. He claims to have had, while he was working for the Queen and Prince Philip at Buckingham Palace, he was a military attaché to Buckingham Palace for 7 years, working mostly for the Duke of Edinburgh. He claims to have had a 2-hour meeting with an extraterrestrial, human-appearing being in the middle of London. And all those details I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but Sir Peter told me that he learned a great deal, and it was a very, very disturbing experience for him. He learned a great deal about various entities coming here, their extraordinary powers, their ability to take care of themselves by their astonishing abilities such as telepathy and various other abilities. What bothered Sir Peter more than anything, he told me, and this didn't appear in his book, and I published it for the first time in my new book, is that not only could this alien read Sir Peter's mind, he knew all Britain's top secret nuclear secrets. Next. Anyone know who this is? Any volunteers? Speak up. Lindbergh. It's amazing how many people say that. No, it's not. I'll put you out of your misery. This is 1942. This is Frederick C. Durant, who headed the UFO debunking project for the CIA in 1953. You may remember that. This was him in 1942. He was a test pilot, naval officer. He became a commander later on. He was a specialist in missiles, rockets. And let me just quote, first of all, this was on Squadron VN-15 photo. He was did a lot of test flying of many aircraft, and I met him in October of 2004. But let me just quote how the Robertson panel or the Durant report concluded their recommendations on debunking UFO things. It's quite familiar, but there may be some newcomers here. They had to debunk the subject, they said, because the continued emphasis on the reporting of these phenomena does, in these parlous times, result in a threat to the orderly functioning of the protective organs of the body politic. Now, Ruppelt had said that the CIA had actually ordered the Air Force to debunk all sightings and discredit witnesses and pilots at this time. Now then, Fred Durant was at liberty in 2004 to tell me that he'd actually been contracted to the CIA as a naval officer for quite some time, to the Office of Scientific Intelligence of the CIA. And I met him. Next slide, please. This is a picture I took of him. He's a lovely gentleman, very cultured gentleman, great sense of humor. And I met him in North Carolina, and he said, "Timothy, you're still chasing these flying saucers." And he collapsed. This was as he took my coat off, he's a real gentleman. Anyway, we had a wonderful day together, and he was laughing at everything I said, but he came out with a few interesting things. Now, I sent him something, I think it was about the O'Hare airport incident, which, as you know, was several months before they came out with it. And I received this email from him in March 2007. Hi, good friend. Never, never, ever give up. Happy springtime. Every good wish. Fred Durant. Next, please. This is the mighty B-36, or in this case, the case relates to an RB, reconnaissance version B-36, 10-engine bomber, known as the Peacemaker. Now, there's an extraordinary case which happened in 1956, which was thoroughly checked out by Richard Haynes and Franklin Carter and published in the International UFO Reporter and elsewhere. This aircraft was on a reconnaissance photo-recce flight from Ellsworth Air Force Base, Rapid City, South Dakota. They had a 17-man crew on and a 5-man relief crew on board. And suddenly, they encountered a flying disc. And I've actually made a sketch of this myself based on the ratio of the size of the dome to this 100-foot diameter disc. So we can have the next slide, please. A little bit darker. Thank you very much. This is my rendition. What I couldn't do, ladies and gentlemen, is on the rim of this craft, there were myriad different lights flashing in a kind of sequence. I could not reproduce that for you, I'm afraid. But anyway, it's interesting that the crew all took pictures with special 35mm Hane cameras that had been issued to them by Project Blue Book in such an eventuality. So when they got back on the ground, however, the principal witness says we had to turn in all of our logs, equipment, everything, including film, to an intelligence unit called Recce-Tech, Reconnaissance Technology, which was a central processing unit for the whole wing. And this was the 28th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing of the 718th Squadron. Very, very impressive case. And there were many reports like this, of really close encounters with these guys. Next, please. Now, unfortunately, this is not a photograph, and I do not know the name of the aircraft carrier involved. It was published in the Communion newsletter, Whitley Strieber's newsletter, many years ago, and I find it very convincing, particularly in view of other cases involving aircraft carriers which I've come across. Now, this took place in the vicinity of the Philippines in 1957, and according to the US Navy radar operator, he said the top of the radar screen suddenly whited out. Within seconds, the radio commentary from all the 4 accompanying destroyers described a large cylindrical metal object located immediately above our carrier. When I joined the over 3,000 men from 5 ships who were out on deck, I was able to see a dark grey cigar-shaped object over 4,000 feet long and about 350 feet in diameter. The carrier captain refused to launch any jets to investigate. You know, on aircraft carriers, they usually have 2, sometimes 1, but I think 2, like particularly F-4 Phantoms at the time, to launch to investigate any sort of intruders, to check them out. But they weren't launched. So if any of you know the name of that aircraft carrier, I'd be very glad, I'm sure we'd all be glad to hear of it. But I have published in my book other cases involving named aircraft carriers. Next slide, please. This is Gordon Cooper, astronaut. I knew him, I admired him, I dedicated need to know to him. I have a great admiration for him, and certainly one of the most laid-back of astronauts. And he not only chased UFOs when he was with the US Air Force Europe in Germany in the 1950s, but in 1957 he was director of the Flight Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base when a flying saucer actually landed on the base and was filmed with all types of film by his camera crew. And now, Gordon Cooper did not see this event himself. He's published the story in great detail in his book, in his autobiography. And he wasn't allowed, he was told he had to send the film back immediately after it had been developed. He wasn't allowed to project it or anything, but he managed to have a look at a few frames, and he said it was quite clearly a disc, and it had come down and landing legs about 30 feet in diameter, and then it took off. Next. This is Admiral Hillencutter. I always quote his extraordinary statement in 1960, partly on behalf of NICAP, Major Kehoe's organization, which was sent as a letter to Congress. And he'd said, you know, behind the scenes, Air Force officers are soberly concerned about the UFOs, but through official secrecy and ridicule, note that, official ridicule, many citizens are led to believe the unknown flying objects are nonsense. And that's coming from Admiral Hillencutter, who was one of the early directors of the CIA. Next, please. Just darken that a little if possible, please. Thank you. That's it. Thank you very much. Now, George Adamski wasn't the only guy to observe craft with spheres underneath a flying saucer. This was observed by a United States Air Force pilot on the ground in Nevada on the 23rd of November, 1957. It was his first Lieutenant Joseph Long of the 97th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. And the event happened, he was about 30 miles west of Tonopah, Nevada. It was about 6-something in the morning, 10 past 6 in the morning. He suddenly heard a high-pitched whining noise, which drew his attention to 4 disc-shaped objects on the ground about 300 to 400 yards to the right of the highway. He approached to within 50 feet of the nearest object. The others were identical in shape, about 50 feet in diameter, emitting their own source of light, with a glowing, brightly transparent dome and 3 landing gears. The hum then increased to a pitch that hurt his ears, and the objects lifted off the ground, then the gears retracted. And at a leisurely speed of 10 miles an hour, proceeded across the highway and then eventually vanished. And this report is an official Project Blue Book report, and it was first published by Dr. Alan Hynek in his the UFO report. I can tell you, in case some of you hadn't suspected, that Dr. Alan Hynek not only was contracted to the United States Air Force from 1940s and onwards, but also to the Office of Scientific Intelligence, Office of OSI, Office of Scientific Intelligence, Central Intelligence Agency. Next, please. I like to show this. Make this a bit lighter, please, if possible. It's quite important. Thank you. A bit more. It's important to see this isn't a cutout, thing. A little bit lighter, if possible. Thank you very much. Is it possible to make it lighter? Well, sort of. Anyway, thank you very much. Now, this was taken by George Adamski in Silver Spring, Maryland, in February of 1965. There were 4 other witnesses, one of whom is a dear friend of mine, Madeline Rodefer. If you want her telephone number, you can talk to her about it. She's elderly, but she's very much compos mentis. The craft was about 27 feet in diameter, at least according to optical physicist William Sherwood. It was taken to Kodak. It was authenticated by this guy who was a senior project development engineer at the time. And as it moved around in a very strange darting movement, it appeared to be changing shape, like distorting. I don't think that this is, in my opinion, pure conjecture relating to the self-generating gravitational field, perhaps, I don't know, which produces effects, atmospheric effects. At any rate, interestingly, in 1998, next slide, please, I was invited by the director of the Defense Airborne Reconnaissance Office. At that time, they handled the unmanned aerial vehicle spy planes, such as Dark Star and Global Hawk and so forth. And I was invited for a meeting at the Pentagon. I was expecting a one-to-one with General Israel here, but I was rather disturbed to see that the whole room was full of young officers from various services who were attached to the DARO, the Defense Airborne Reconnaissance Office at the time. And anyway, during the course of my meeting, the general showed the various frames from this film, which were reproduced in my book, Above Top Secret. And he said, "Timothy, I don't see any way these could have been faked." That was his opinion. Next, please. I have intriguing information in my new book about President Kennedy. I was informed by a member of White House staff that in 1961-62, President Kennedy requested permission to examine the alien bodies retrieved from goodness knows where. No specifics were given to me about which incident, but he wanted to see the alien bodies. His wish was granted. He was taken on this Air Force One with a whole gaggle of generals, including General McHugh, and taken to Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, where at a special medical facility his wish was granted. I have no more information than that, other than that the whole thing was conducted under extreme secrecy, and it remains top secret to this day. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite photographs of a UFO. It was taken in 1963. It's been debunked by an awful lot of people who don't seem to know what they're really talking about, because professionals have examined it, such as topographers, say all the shadows are absolutely commensurate with the details. If you can make it, well, there is the disk. There is actually a highway behind. This was taken near Maiquisha in Venezuela, 1963, by an Avenza Airlines pilot flying in the right-hand seat, the first officer. This is a DC-4, I worked out, four-engine plane. There is the nacelle, or the prop spinner, one of the engines on the starboard side. There is the craft, which was very, very shiny. It's quite possible that there may be a reflection of the airliner on the top here. Can we make it a little bit darker just for a second, please? A little bit darker, the previous slide, please. Is it possible to make that darker? That's it. Thank you very much. That's great. That's the highway behind. It's not a trail from the saucer. And there's the shadow there. This is jungle. And the plane was on its finals to Maiquisha Airport. But proportionately, all the shadows tally with the right, they are in the right position. Next, please. If we can lighten that one up. Thank you very much. This is a B-52, a B-52H, in fact. And in my book, I describe the case of Bradford Runyon, Jr., who was sitting in the right-hand seat as instructor on 24th of October, 1968. This is a case that appears in the Blue Book records. But I got in touch with him, and he gave me some information. They were approaching Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota, when they were requested to check on something in the area. And when requested, they said, well, what are we supposed to check on? And the response came from ground control, you'll know it when you see it. Then an object approached on their radar scopes at very, very high speed and suddenly stopped and stayed with the aircraft for a while, and then within 10 miles of the base. And then they lost all radio contact. Then it came back. Then they were instructed to overfly this object, which by this time had landed at Minot Air Force Base near a nuclear missile bunker. We were told to go back and overfly the object, again losing radio contact with base. The radar return on our B-52 showed the UFO about 5 times as large as a KC-135 tanker. That's the Boeing 707 tanker version. And The closure originally was estimated at 3,000 miles an hour. Looking down on the object from 2,000 feet, it looked to me several hundred feet long and glowed dark orange with blue and green lights. Next, please. I don't know how many of you have seen a documentary called Apollo 11, The Untold Story. Yes? It was shown in England last year, but I don't know if it has. I'm sure it has been shown. Any of you seen it? One? Any advance on one? I don't think so. Anyway, during this extraordinary documentary, Buzz Aldrin acknowledged that, there'd been a UFO that was pacing them during their flight out to the moon. And they were kind of worried by this, and they made a discreet inquiry to Mission Control and said, how far away is the rocket booster? And they were told, hey guys, that's 6,000 miles away. Well, and Mike Collins observed this thing through a telescope and said it was a bell-shaped object. Now, Aldrin said, obviously the three of us weren't going to blurt out, hey Houston, we've got something moving alongside and we don't know what it is, can you tell us what it is? Because they realized that all sorts of people would be listening in. Interestingly, on this program was Dr. David Baker, who was the Apollo 11 chief scientist, and he confirms officially that this event took place. Next slide, please, which I think should be a blank. Thank you very much. I have an extraordinary case regarding a Chilean Navy frigate from 1969, October 1969. This was provided for me by Australia's leading researcher, Bill Chalker. And this was the name of the bark. It's a sort of transport ship, military transport ship, known as the Aquila. It was 350 miles off Valparaiso at night when Combat Information Center, that's CIC, in the ship reported a long-range airborne contact. A minute later, the distance reduced to 400 nautical miles, then suddenly to 150 miles. It was moving at about 12,780 statute miles an hour. At 12 miles, the single contact appeared on the radar scope as 6 separate targets. When visual contact was established, the ship's commander was summoned, and according to the witness named Leus, one massive rectangular object was accompanied by 5 smaller objects. The huge, giant one had sort of scooped out semicircles along the side of the hull or whatever. The smaller ones were maximum 8 foot in size. At 300 yards distance, a humming sound could be heard, at which point the frigate's power cut out for a short while as the huge object passed overhead with a very, very powerful light. The power returned at about 200 yards. As the craft left, it was about 200 yards away, having appeared right over the ship. The smaller craft never came closer than 500 to 1,000 yards. Then they all joined up in a larger one and vanished eventually at a distance of 2 miles. All on board were ordered not to discuss the incident, and the ship's log entry was changed, as it is in all cases involving ship's logs. This is why you'll never get anything out of the Navy, particularly the United States Navy, nor any other Navy. They've come up with very, very little, I think you'll agree. And I've spoken to enough naval officers to know that the ship's logs are either, the entry is deleted or they are changed, often in an attempt to imitate the officer's handwriting who've made the entry. When they docked at Valparaiso port, 2 Chilean naval officers came on board, accompanied by 4 Spanish-speaking Americans from the United States Naval Attaché's office. They were questioned about what they saw separately and told repeatedly, you did not see that. And they were threatened and their families threatened, and you can understand the rest of it, the usual sort of thing. Next slide, please. Here's a case in the Disclosure Project. There was quite a bit about this extraordinary story regarding an incident 1971 above the USS John F. Kennedy. in the Caribbean area. I spoke to one of the principal witnesses, Jim Kopf, who held top-secret crypto clearance at the time, and he said suddenly everything went berserk, all the incoming messages were all garbled, and they went up on deck eventually with one of his mates, and the aircraft carrier, and most people were not on deck. There'd been a very tiring operation. There weren't more than about 20 people on the deck at the time, but they saw this huge, giant sphere right above the tower of the aircraft carrier, and all power was cut. The power was drained from the craft. The interceptor phantoms couldn't get off the deck to intercept it. But there were at least 18 witnesses, at least one of whom has come forward. Next, please. This is another case I want to tell you. It's very important. I don't know how many of you are aware that in 1973 and 74 there were some extraordinary things going on at Kirtland Air Force Base, particularly in the Manzano laboratory area, which of course, stores the nuclear weapons. And this information comes from a guy called R.C. Hecker, who was obviously working at the base. And he said even in 73, there was a giant craft, oblate spherical in shape, 150 feet in diameter, golden in color, absolutely silent, hovering approximately 100 feet over plant number 3. And then in 17th of May 1974, on the east side of Manzano Mountains, in the evening, electronic scanning instruments at the Manzano laboratory section of Kirtland Air Force Base East registered a tremendous burst of energy in the 250 to 275 megahertz range, which threw all their instruments completely off scale. The burst of energy was first noted in the Earth's upper atmosphere. A trajectory was plotted. A recovery team was immediately dispatched to the designated impact area. And there was an area southwest of the small mountain community of Chalili, New Mexico, was cordoned off. And a few hours later, what was described as a metallic circular object approximately 60 feet in diameter, before being dismantled for handling, was quietly moved into a hangar at Kirtland Air Force Base. How many of you have heard of that story before? Good, good, I'm glad. Were you by chance associated with APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Association? No? Because it was published in their newsletter, a sort of obscure article, but I think it's extraordinary. In 1977, there were many incidents involving huge craft encountered by nuclear bombers. For example, the French, the Dassault Mirage 4A nuclear bomber. And I spoke to the pilot of one who encountered something. He said it was the size of, he couldn't see the shape very clearly, but it came close to his plane. And of course, he had a navigator in the back seat, and he was very, very frightened by this object. It was about the size of a jumbo jet. And there were many. Next slide, please. All over the place, places that you wouldn't think. In India, the Indian Air Force was chasing these things, having encounters with sometimes enormous craft. Air India, Jumbo, encountered a very large craft. And next slide, please. In 1977, a unique 10-year top-secret research effort was set up by the Soviet government. It was the idea of Yuri Andropov, who was short-term president. He was also head of the notorious KGB before that, but he ordered 4 million soldiers to keep watch for UFOs. This was an official top-secret project to find out as much as possible. It lasted 10 years. There were 4 million soldiers, probably 1 million or so civil servants involved in processing the reports. And an extraordinary, I mean, a worldwide, I mean, all the territories of the Soviet Union were involved in this top-secret research effort. Next, please. I don't know what that is yet. Oh, yes, this is from the National Transportation Safety Board. But in May of 1980, 2 young pilots in the Puerto Rico area disappeared while reporting. At the moment, they were reporting being harassed by a flying object. And you can see the official record here. We are flying from Santo Domingo, that's in Dominican Republic, to San Juan International, just found a weird object in our course that made us change course several times. And that was the last that was heard of them. And they never found the aircraft or the pilots. Next, please. This is part of a defense intelligence report, 1980, in Peru. Peruvian Air Force planes sent up to chase a flying saucer, and it apparently fired upon it at very close range without causing any apparent damage. Interesting. Next, please. Now, Stan Friedman last night showed his favorite slide, the top secret Umbra 1980, the one part of the 21-page affidavit produced by the National Security and Supreme Court, all these blacked out things. Well, they have actually declassified more of it. This I've reproduced in the book. This was declassified, this page, in fact, the whole document was declassified in 2004, and I reproduced 2 pages actually in the book. And they've got a less dramatic form of censorship now. Instead of blacked out bits, they've got whited out bits, which, sort of cause less excitement among the aficionados. But there's quite a bit of interesting information there, but basically they are covering up, quite understandably, methods and sources. Sources particularly. How many embassies they were bugging at the time to find out about flying saucers. Next, please. This was taken, a photograph by 2 pilots were flying a Cessna plane over the Mojave Desert when they were almost rammed by a shadow-like object which came straight forward to them on a collision course. And the next minute, they sensed that it was on their left. And sure enough, it was, and that's just one of several photographs they took. But only one photograph came out showing this object, and I reproduced that in the book. That was in 1985 in the Mojave Desert. A British and an American pilot were on board. Next, please. I see I have 11 minutes left. I'm going to have to rush through the next lot, ladies and gentlemen. Please, next slide. This is, we heard about Woodbridge earlier on and about nuclear weapons stores. Well, no, there weren't any nuclear weapons here as far as I know, but just as in Woodbridge, the UFO was beaming down lights at the weapons storage area. And this is in Kapustin Yar in Russia. In 1989, USS Army Depot. Next one, please. Here's another one. In Kuibyshev, in September 1990, a triangular craft actually landed at a radar station, having first of all caused the radar scope to white out. It landed on the base, it fired a beam of light and completely destroyed the radar station number 12 here. But the beam of light passed right through one of the corporals without causing him any damage at all. And several of the corporals suffered missing time. It's a bizarre story, very, very, quite lengthy actually. I have it in the book. Next, please. I censored this one according to the writer of the letter's instructions. It's a letter to Carl Pflock, who wrote 2 excellent books on Roswell. They're very negative in terms of their conclusions, but they're good books nevertheless. And Carl Pflock was also a former deputy Secretary of Defense. And it's a letter, very, very interesting letter, which I've reproduced in the book, from a friend of mine who I was helping at the time. He was a staffer for a certain senator, trying to find out about UFOs and communications with aliens, all the sort of stuff that Richard Dolan was talking about earlier on today. Needless to say, my friend got absolutely nowhere in his inquiry. I did send several people to him, but he never actually had a reply from Carl Pflock at all. Next, please. Okay, this is a report published for the first time. It only was declassified last year by the British Ministry of Defence about triangular objects which penetrated several Royal Air Force bases in the Midlands in England, in March of 1993. Next slide, please. Haven't got time to go into all the details, unfortunately, but quite clearly they acknowledged that this was a genuine unidentified object. Next slide, please. Now, this is the famous Varginha case of January 1996. I won't go into details here. I've got a chapter on it in the book called The Brazilian Theatre, which is a slight double entendre, because it has the extraordinary description by Dr. Roger Lear of his interview with the surgeon who actually operated on one of the several alien creatures that were captured by the Brazilian military at that time. And it's a long story. A great deal of medical information was acquired by Roger. And then, of course, the bodies, I think they died. There were several of them. No one knows exactly how many. They were autopsied. And then the Americans came in, head of NASA and former Secretary of Defense, I think, came in, and the bodies were mysteriously transported back to the United States. Next slide, please. And where did they go? It makes sense, doesn't it? Next slide, please. This was one of the chevron-shaped objects. I'm sure you're familiar with this excellent drawing, painting seen in Phoenix, March 1997. But I interviewed in my book an extraordinary story by a Sunday Times journalist, a British newspaper, who saw one of these things in the Orkney Islands, that's off the North Scottish coast, which actually appeared to attack her from a distance as she was about to board a British Airways plane. Extraordinary story and slightly disturbing. Next, please. There was a flying triangle seen in 1997 over the then Home Secretary, Michael Howard's house. He denied it completely. I had a letter from him saying he had absolutely no recollection of the incident whatsoever, even though it was published in the newspapers. He was probably more concerned about other types of aliens at the time, being a Home Secretary. But I think the next slide, we have a sketch left of this object. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yes, this was the journalist who saw this thing at 3 o'clock in the morning in the vicinity of a place called Beaumarsh in southern Kent, in a marshland area, and other witnesses saw it right over the Home Secretary's house at the time. Next slide, please. That's a Chinese Air Force plane sent to chase a UFO. There have been many sightings by Chinese Air Force pilots. I could go into a great deal of information about academia in China and how you can't become an official Chinese UFO researcher unless you have a PhD. And there have been hundreds, thousands of sightings there. And this was in Guangzhou City, People's Army Air Base, and the jet was sent up to intercept. And the pilot requested permission to shoot at the UFO, but permission was denied. Next. This is a Boeing 737-400 series of Aer Lingus in January of 2004. It was landing just after 8 o'clock at night on the final approach to Dublin Airport, when, according to a pilot in the landing pattern 5-6 miles behind, in a British Midland plane, saw a giant triangle appear from the sky, flashing violet strobe-type lights. It appeared right in front of this plane in a very harassing manner. It caused the plane tremendous turbulence. The outside air temperature heated to 164 degrees Celsius. There was denting on the wings. The air brakes were damaged. The plane had to make an emergency landing. There was pandemonium on board. Everything was denied, covered up. Later that night, 2 hours later, a similar incident happened to yet another plane. All the pilots were sworn to secrecy and threatened, apparently. There's a great deal of information. Everything denied, but I think these are important cases. Next. And how does the Times, our Times newspaper, react to all this stuff? Pie in the sky. Flying saucers, a close encounter with the human imagination. UFOs do not exist. It is official, says the Ministry of Defense. Let's have a look. Next slide. This is part of a 465-page Ministry of Defense document, recently declassified a couple of years ago, dating back to 2000, dealing with unexplained aerial phenomena, UAPs. Classified, secret, you can say UK eyes only, they're restricted, secret. Does the Ministry of Defense say they don't exist? No. It even warns against the fact that there have been an increase in UAP events. This is talking about near collisions with UFOs, okay? And it says no attempt should be made to outmaneuver a UAP during interception. The government does take this stuff seriously. Next, please. I have 3 minutes left. That's just a photograph I pulled off the internet. I don't often do that, but I like it. It was taken in Puerto Rico. I've been there 7 times, and it has the look of authenticity about it for me. Next, please. I don't need to say anything about that. This is how the story appeared in the Times in London, in the weather section. Okay. Next slide. This is Paul Hellyer, former Canadian Minister of Defence. On the right, sitting with Steve Bassett there, and of course Richard Dolan and Stan Friedman. And this was in 2005, when this man, Hellyer, former Secretary of Defense, Minister of Defense in the Trudeau regime, he said, UFOs are as real as the airplanes that fly over your head. The classification was from the outset above top secret. So the vast majority of US officials, let alone a mere allied Minister of Defense, were never in the loop. The time has come to lift the veil of secrecy and let the truth emerge so there can be a real and informed debate about one of the most important problems facing our planet today. 1 minute left. Next slide, please. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. I'm not going to go into the reasons why they're here and so on and so forth, but I thought you might enjoy this. Thank you very much once again.